It began with a silence that echoed across a broken continent, two defeated, isolated nations staring at the world that refused to trust them. In 1918, when the guns of World War I finally fell quiet, Europe celebrated peace, but for Germany and the new Soviet Russia, the war's end brought not relief but a strange kind of exile. Both nations, for different reasons, found themselves standing outside the doors of the post-war world, shunned, humiliated, and distrusted. No one could have imagined that these two wounded giants, bitter and ideologically hostile, would eventually shape a secret partnership that altered the fate of Europe. Yet, the early years after World War I offered the first clues of a relationship that would move from cooperation to suspicion, from necessity to rivalry, and finally explode into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Germany's humiliation began with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, a document so harsh that it cut deep into the national psyche. The treaty reduced the German army to a fraction of its size, banned tanks, aircraft, and submarines, stripped Germany of territory, demanded impossible reparations, and forced the nation to accept full responsibility for the war. This war guilt clause created a sense of injustice among Germans, who felt punished beyond reason. Meanwhile, across the East, Russia had endured its own catastrophe. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 overthrew the centuries-old Tsarist monarchy, replacing it with a communist government that terrified Western nations. During the Russian Civil War, Britain, France, the United States, and others even sent troops to help anti-Bolshevik forces. When the Civil War ended in a Bolshevik victory, the new Soviet state found itself isolated, feared, and diplomatically unwelcome. It was this shared isolation that quietly pushed Germany and Soviet Russia toward each other. Neither had many friends. Both had been excluded from the Versailles peace negotiations. Both felt mistreated by the Western powers. And both recognized that cooperation, however temporary, might offer a way to survive the new world order. This unexpected alignment took its first formal shape in 1922, when Germany and Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Rapallo. The treaty was simple on the surface: each side renounced financial and territorial claims against the other. But behind closed doors, Rapallo opened the door to secret military cooperation. Because the Versailles Treaty banned Germany from training with tanks, aircraft, or chemical weapons on its own soil, the Soviet Union offered vast, hidden spaces where German officers could train privately. In return, the Germans shared technological expertise and industrial connections that helped the Soviet Union modernize. It was a strange, pragmatic partnership: communists and defeated Democrats working together because they had no better choice. For nearly a decade, military cooperation flourished quietly. German pilots trained near Lipetsk. Tank crews practiced in Kazan. Chemical weapons research facilities operated far from Western eyes. The world remained largely unaware of this silent alliance. Yet beneath the cooperation, distrust lingered. Germany wanted to break free from Versailles and reclaim its place in Europe. The Soviet Union wanted time to rebuild its shattered economy and military. Neither side viewed the other as a friend; they were tools, stepping stones, temporary conveniences in a hostile world. And by the early 1930s, the fragile balance began to shift. The turning point came in 1933, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Hitler's worldview, outlined in his book Mein Kampf, was built on hatred of communism, hatred of Slavic people, hatred of the Soviet Union. He believed Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East. This meant conquering Soviet territory, enslaving its people, and destroying the communist state entirely. As soon as Hitler became chancellor, Germany withdrew from arms control agreements, began rearming openly, and reduced cooperation with Moscow. The partnership forged after Rapallo seemed to be collapsing. The Soviet leadership watched Hitler's rise with alarm. They knew Germany would become a threat. Yet, at the same time, Stalin recognized that the Western powers Britain and France were doing little to stop Hitler. In 1936, Germany marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. Britain and France protested, but they did not act. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Again, no one intervened. Later that same year, the Munich Agreement allowed Hitler to seize the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union was not even invited to the negotiations, despite being an ally of Czechoslovakia. Stalin began to suspect that Britain and France were hoping to push Hitler eastward to let Germany destroy the Soviet Union. As Europe drifted closer to war, the Soviet Union searched for security. Stalin attempted to negotiate with the Western democracies, proposing a united front against Germany. But Britain and France hesitated, distrusting Soviet intentions. Their negotiations were slow, cautious, and half-hearted. Meanwhile, German diplomats moved quickly, recognizing that a Soviet partnership, even a temporary one, could protect Germany from a two-front war. By 1938–39, the relationship between Germany and the USSR stood at a crossroads, ideological enemies, yet strategic needs were pulling them back toward cooperation. Germany feared being encircled by Western powers and the USSR. The Soviet Union feared being abandoned by the West and targeted by Germany. The memory of Rapallo lingered, proof that practical necessity could overcome ideological hatred, at least for a while. Thus, between the ruins of old empires and the rising tensions of a new world, the foundations of a shocking diplomatic gamble were laid. Both nations had suffered isolation after World War I. Both had turned to each other in the early 1920s. Both had drifted apart with Hitler's rise. Yet, as 1939 approached, they found themselves again alone, mistrustful of the West, and increasingly aware that cooperation even with a sworn enemy might be the only way to survive. What followed would become one of the most unexpected alliances in history and a turning point that would plunge the world into war. The tension in Europe grew like a storm forming at the horizon, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. As the 1930s progressed, the world watched Adolf Hitler transform Germany from a humiliated republic into a fierce and unpredictable power. Yet few understood how desperately Hitler needed one thing before unleashing his next move: time. And in a twist that would shock every nation in Europe, he sought that time from the very country he publicly despised, the Soviet Union. Germany's foreign policy after 1933 was a rapid sequence of bold steps designed to test the patience of Britain and France. Each gamble: rearmament, the Rhineland reoccupation, the annexation of Austria, revealed something crucial to Hitler: the Western democracies were unwilling to confront him. Their governments were haunted by the memories of World War I, terrified of another catastrophic conflict. Hitler recognized this fear and pushed forward with increasing confidence. Every unopposed move encouraged him to take another. But while Germany surged forward, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin watched with a mix of alarm and calculation. The USSR had expected Britain and France to form a strong defensive line against the revival of German aggression. Instead, Stalin witnessed a pattern of hesitation. When Hitler dismantled Czechoslovakia in 1938, the Soviet leadership realized that the Western powers might prefer peace at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing smaller nations. To Stalin, this raised a chilling possibility: perhaps the Western democracies hoped Germany would expand eastward, destroying the Soviet Union without costing them a single soldier. The distrust deepened as Europe approached 1939. Hitler's speeches grew more aggressive, and his militarization became impossible to ignore. At the same time, the Soviet Union was dealing with unrest in its own borders, purging officers, reassigning diplomats, and reinforcing its western frontier. Stalin understood that Germany was becoming dangerously powerful, but he also knew that confronting Hitler alone would be suicidal. The USSR needed allies, or at least an agreement that could delay conflict. By early 1939, Poland stood directly in Hitler's crosshairs. Germany demanded access to the Polish corridor and control of Danzig, a port city with a majority German population. Poland refused. Britain and France promised to defend Polish independence, hoping to convince Hitler to back down. But Hitler was unmoved. He anticipated war, and he was preparing for it. His only fear was fighting on two fronts again, the same mistake Germany had made in World War I. If he attacked Poland without securing his eastern flank, the Soviet Union might intervene, creating a disastrous situation. This fear pushed Germany to consider an unimaginable option: diplomacy with the Soviet Union. For years, Hitler had denounced communism, calling it a disease. His propaganda machine attacked Stalin relentlessly. Yet, when strategy demanded it, ideology became secondary. Hitler knew that if Germany and the Soviet Union could agree to stay out of each other's way, he would be free to strike Poland without hesitation. Meanwhile, Stalin was engaged in his own calculations. Negotiations with Britain and France were dragging on without meaningful progress. The Western powers sent low-ranking representatives, arrived slowly, and avoided making firm commitments. Their reluctance to give the USSR freedom to move troops through Eastern Europe made cooperation seem nearly impossible. Stalin wondered why they refused to negotiate seriously at such a critical moment. The answer seemed clear: they wanted Hitler and Stalin to weaken each other. Why else would they avoid clear terms and concrete action? At the same time, Germany sent clear, urgent signals. Unlike Britain and France, German diplomats offered something extremely appealing to Stalin: certainty. They promised neutrality, respect, and secrecy. They offered tangible benefits, especially the possibility of regaining territories lost after World War I. More importantly, Germany proposed a clear, binding agreement without hesitation, delay, or moral lectures. This direct approach intrigued Stalin. He had no illusions about Hitler's intentions, but he understood that temporary cooperation could give the USSR the one thing it desperately needed: time to prepare for the conflict he believed was inevitable. The turning point came in August 1939, when high-level German envoys proposed a full non-aggression pact. For Stalin, the offer was bold, surprising, and strategically perfect. The Soviet leadership knew the world would react with shock, but they also recognized that the survival of their state depended on buying time. The USSR agreed to negotiations with remarkable speed. In Berlin, the news was celebrated. Hitler viewed the potential pact as a masterstroke. If he could neutralize the Soviet Union, destroying Poland would be easy. France and Britain might protest, but they would be unable to prevent Germany from crushing Poland in a matter of weeks. Hitler needed the pact not as a long-term friendship but as a shield for immediate expansion. The negotiations in Moscow were conducted with astonishing efficiency. The German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, arrived in the Soviet capital on an urgent flight. The meeting with Stalin and Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov took place in a tense but business-like atmosphere. There were no illusions: each side knew the other was acting out of pure strategic necessity. Yet the speed with which both leaders reached agreement reflected their shared understanding of the geopolitical moment. What made the deal extraordinary was not the non-aggression pledge, but the secret agreement that accompanied it. Germany and the USSR quietly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Soviets would gain control over eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and territories in Romania. Germany would take western Poland and several other key regions. It was a cynical partition of nations whose people had no idea their fate was being decided in a private room in Moscow. On the night of August 23, 1939, the pact was signed. It was a moment that stunned the world. Newspapers across Europe published the story with disbelief. How could two ideological enemies suddenly embrace neutrality? How could Hitler, who preached about the destruction of Bolshevism, shake hands with Stalin? The answer was simple: power, strategy, and survival had briefly outweighed ideology. Within days, Hitler finalized his plans for the invasion of Poland. With the Eastern Front secured, Germany prepared for war. Stalin, meanwhile, began planning the reoccupation of lands lost 2 decades earlier. While the world debated the morality of the pact, the two dictators quietly set their machinery in motion. Europe was on the brink of a catastrophe neither side fully understood. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not represent trust, friendship, or ideological alignment. It was the product of fear, ambition, and the cold logic of realpolitik. Both nations believed they had outsmarted the other. Both believed they had gained precious time. And neither realized that the pact they signed would lead directly to the bloodiest front of World War II. When the world first saw the announcement of a German-Soviet agreement in late August 1939, disbelief rippled through every capital. Diplomats read the news once, then twice, convinced there must have been a mistake. How could the most outspoken enemy of communism suddenly embrace the Soviet Union? How could Stalin, who had spent years warning his people about fascist danger, now open his doors to Nazi Germany? What the world did not know, what no newspaper dared to imagine, was that the public treaty was only the surface of a much deeper, darker arrangement unfolding behind locked doors. In Moscow, the night the agreement was finalized felt almost surreal to those who witnessed it. The German delegation arrived with a sense of urgency that left even seasoned Soviet officials taken aback. The speed of the negotiations, the clarity of demands, and the absence of ideological posturing made the conversations feel less like diplomacy and more like a high-stakes transaction. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, spoke as though every hour mattered, and in truth, it did. Germany stood on the brink of invading Poland, and without Soviet neutrality, the entire plan risked collapsing. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin appeared calm, even cordial. Those present later remarked that Stalin seemed fully aware of the historical magnitude of the moment. He knew he was dealing with a regime that viewed the Soviet Union as its eventual target. But he also knew that accepting the pact could buy him precious time he believed he could use to rebuild an army still weakened by purges and reorganizations. To him, Germany's desperation was an advantage, a card he could play to claim territory and secure buffers along the western frontier. The public text of the treaty, the one newspapers published, sounded harmless enough. Two nations promising not to attack each other. Two governments pledging to resolve disputes peacefully. It appeared as though both sides were simply trying to avoid war. Many foreign observers tried to convince themselves that perhaps Stalin and Hitler had set aside ideology for stability. But the real story lay hidden in a sealed document signed in the same room, moments after the public treaty, the secret protocol that carved up Eastern Europe like a silent blueprint of conquest. In that secret document, Germany and the USSR agreed on the fate of nations neither of them had the right to decide. Poland was to be split down the middle. The Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and later Lithuania were assigned to the Soviet sphere. Finland's future was left uncertain but clearly marked for Soviet interest. Even Bessarabia, a Romanian territory, appeared on the Soviet wish list. The ease with which these borders were drawn showed how little either dictator cared for the sovereignty of smaller states. Maps were revised as casually as if someone were rearranging furniture. In Berlin, Hitler received the news of the signing with unrestrained triumph. He believed he had pulled off the diplomatic coup of the century. By neutralizing the USSR, he had eliminated the threat of a two-front war. His generals could focus entirely on Poland and the West, confident that the Soviets would not interfere. This new freedom electrified the German high command. Troops were already massing on Poland's border, and now nothing stood in their way. In Moscow, the reaction was more restrained but equally strategic. Stalin understood that he had not forged a friendship, he had negotiated a pause. The Soviet leader believed Germany would eventually turn east, just as Hitler had promised in his writings. But Stalin also believed that by extending Soviet borders westward and gaining buffer states, he could delay that future attack long enough to strengthen his defenses. In his mind, the pact was a temporary shield, not a permanent solution. As the ink dried on the treaty, events began moving with unsettling speed. German troops invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, unleashing a wave of destruction with a scale and speed the world had never seen. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry advanced in coordinated strikes, overwhelming Polish forces within days. Britain and France declared war on Germany, keeping their promise to defend Poland, but their armies remained largely inactive, trapped behind the Maginot Line as Poland struggled alone. Stalin watched the German advance closely, waiting for the moment agreed upon in the secret protocol. On September 17, when Poland's defense was collapsing, the Soviet Union launched its own invasion from the east. While Germany justified its attack by claiming to protect German minorities, the Soviet Union framed its invasion as an effort to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians. But behind the rhetoric, both sides were simply fulfilling the terms of their hidden agreement. By month's end, Poland had been erased from the map, torn apart by two powers whose pact allowed for such brutality. The Soviet Union then turned its attention northward. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were pressured into signing mutual assistance agreements. These were presented as friendly arrangements, but they allowed Soviet troops to enter the Baltic states, paving the way for full annexation. When Finland resisted similar demands, the Winter War erupted, a conflict far more difficult than Stalin expected. Yet even that war was rooted in the secret geographic ambitions outlined during the August negotiations. Meanwhile, Germany pursued dominance in Western Europe, confident that its eastern flank was safe. But even as the partnership appeared strong, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. German officials grew uneasy about the extent of Soviet gains. Soviet leaders became suspicious of German movements in the Balkans. Public speeches grew colder. Reports from diplomats, spies, and border guards hinted that the cooperation had limits rapidly approaching their breaking point. Despite this growing mistrust, the pact continued to shape the strategic decisions of both nations through 1940. Hitler's victories in Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France were all made easier because he did not have to commit forces to watch the Soviet border. Stalin, equally unconcerned about German aggression in the short term, focused on absorbing the Baltic states and expanding influence in Eastern Europe. Yet neither leader was comfortable with the arrangement. Hitler bristled at sharing influence in Eastern Europe. Stalin disliked seeing German power sweep so quickly across the continent. The pact had bought both sides time, but it did not resolve their deeper ambitions. To two dictators who dreamed of dominance, coexistence was never going to be permanent. By late 1940, the diplomatic warmth had cooled into suspicion, then distrust, and finally fear. In Berlin, strategists began drawing up plans for a massive strike on the Soviet Union. In Moscow, Stalin tried to interpret every German move, unsure whether Hitler would honor the pact for another year, another month, or another week. What had begun as a moment of convenience was now a ticking fuse. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was more than a diplomatic agreement, it was a temporary bridge built over a deep political abyss. Both sides crossed it with caution, each believing the other would eventually attempt to destroy it. And while the pact reshaped Europe in the short term, it also planted the seeds of a future conflict whose scale neither country fully anticipated. By the end of 1940, the uneasy calm between Germany and the Soviet Union felt like a fragile glass pane, transparent, delicate, and destined to shatter with the slightest pressure. On the surface, diplomatic courtesies continued, speeches remained polite, and official visits still took place with forced smiles. Yet beneath this thin layer of protocol, a sense of impending conflict hung heavy in the air. Both sides had expanded their territories under the shadow of the pact, but now those very gains pushed them into confrontation. Two powers that had quietly redrawn half of Europe began to circle each other like predators who had briefly shared a territory neither intended to give up. In Berlin, Hitler watched the rapid changes across the continent with growing impatience. His armies had swept through Western Europe in a series of quick victories, leaving France defeated and Britain struggling to survive. But instead of feeling secure, Hitler found himself uneasy. The Soviet Union had expanded far more than he liked. Stalin's annexation of the Baltics, his actions in Bessarabia, and his continued interest in the Balkans all pressed against German ambitions. The more the USSR grew, the more Hitler felt his vision of a German empire threatened. The pact that had once been a masterstroke now appeared to him as a chain restraining his true plans. Stalin, on the other hand, viewed Germany's victories with a mix of anxiety and suspicion. The speed with which the Wehrmacht had conquered France unsettled him deeply. He had underestimated Hitler's military strength, and each German success made him question how long the pact would hold. Reports from Soviet intelligence suggested that German industrial output had reached staggering levels. Massive troop movements in Eastern Europe began to look troublingly like preparations for something bigger. Yet Stalin, ever calculating, believed he could delay any confrontation by avoiding provocation and fulfilling German trade demands. He increased shipments of grain, oil, and raw materials to Germany, hoping to persuade Hitler that cooperation was still more valuable than conflict. But Hitler's mind had already crossed the point of return. By December 1940, he had signed Directive No. 21, known only to a handful of his top generals, which laid out plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union under the codename Operation Barbarossa. The decision did not emerge suddenly, it grew from years of ideological hatred and a belief that destroying the USSR would guarantee German dominance. Hitler convinced himself that the pact was only a temporary convenience and that Europe's future required a decisive confrontation. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months, opening vast lands for German colonization. Meanwhile, Stalin misread the situation entirely. His intelligence agents sent multiple warnings, some from sources placed frighteningly close to German command, but Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would attack so soon. The pact had served both sides well, he reasoned. Germany still faced Britain, and launching a war in the East would stretch its forces thin. Stalin dismissed warnings as British attempts to create paranoia and drag the USSR into the war. His doubts became a dangerous blind spot. As winter turned to spring in 1941, German preparations became impossible to hide. Trains carrying troops, artillery, and supplies moved steadily toward the Soviet border. New airfields appeared overnight. Spy planes flew repeated reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory. Yet each time advisors urged caution, Stalin brushed aside their fears. He insisted Germany was simply posturing to pressure the USSR during trade negotiations. It was a miscalculation that would cost millions of lives. For German commanders, the months before the invasion were consumed with planning a massive military operation unlike anything attempted before. 3 army groups were positioned to strike simultaneously across a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers. Their objective was nothing short of destroying the Red Army before it could retreat, capturing key cities, and breaking Soviet power in one swift summer campaign. The confidence in Berlin bordered on arrogance. Hitler's earlier victories had convinced him that Germany was unstoppable. While German divisions assembled near the border, Soviet forces remained dangerously unprepared. Many were stationed too close to the frontier in exposed positions. Ammunition stockpiles were low, aircraft were left wingtip to wingtip on airfields, and communication networks were outdated. The purges of the late 1930s had eliminated many experienced Soviet officers, replacing them with newer commanders who lacked authority and hesitation. Despite receiving intelligence reports, maps, and accounts of German troop movements, the Soviet High Command hesitated to take defensive measures, fearing Hitler might interpret them as provocative. In the diplomatic arena, the theatrics continued even as war approached. German and Soviet officials exchanged courteous notes. Trade delegations met to finalize shipments of materials. Foreign ministers delivered speeches praising cooperation. But behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Lines of communication grew shorter and more formal, and military attachés reported that meetings had become noticeably colder. The sense of distant politeness masked an undercurrent of preparing for betrayal. By early June 1941, the border region had transformed into a silent war zone. German troops waited in forests, concealed beneath camouflage nets. Tanks sat lined up in fields covered with canvas. Supply depots bulged with ammunition and fuel. Commanders studied maps lit only by dim lamps to avoid drawing attention. And on the Soviet side, frontier guards watched the buildup nervously, unsure whether to report every odd movement or dismiss it as exaggerated paranoia. Then came the night of June 21. Along the long frontier from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, German divisions received the final order. Radios crackled with coded messages. Engines turned over in the darkness. Aircraft crews strapped into their cockpits. The invasion would begin within hours. German officers later described the atmosphere as eerily quiet, a sense of anticipation mixed with certainty that history was about to shift violently. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the sky erupted. German artillery opened fire in a thunderous barrage that shattered the morning calm. Tanks roared across the border. Columns of infantry advanced behind them. Hundreds of aircraft swept into Soviet airspace, bombing airfields, railways, and communication centers. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and with it, the temporary embrace created by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was ripped apart in an instant. Stalin, receiving the news in the early hours, was reportedly stunned into silence. For months he had insisted the warnings were lies, manipulations, or misunderstandings. Now, confronted with the overwhelming reality of a German invasion, he faced the consequences of his misjudgment. Cities fell quickly. Armies were encircled. Communication lines collapsed. The speed of the German advance brought shock and chaos across the Soviet Union. The pact that once reshaped Europe had now become a haunting memory, a reminder of calculations made in desperation and trust misplaced in a moment of geopolitical necessity. Both nations had believed they could manipulate the other. Both believed they had gained time to prepare for an inevitable confrontation. But when the silence finally broke on that June morning, the true cost of that temporary alliance unfolded in fire, destruction, and one of the most brutal wars the world would ever witness.